what I'm going to try and do is talk about my journey. And again, with few caveats that this journey in any sense should not be taken as how it was going to be for anybody who is either an early career or are looking for a career within animal welfare. A lot of circumstances are also molded by geopolitics, which could differ variedly from different places and from different time. So in that sense, it's just what it should be taken as is a story. And but maybe at the end, I'm going to talk more about Asia and the need to do that. And probably we could discuss on some of those. There are a few things which I'm not going to get into, is just my just for the lack of time, is my evolution of the school of philosophy, in the sense like whether I subscribe to an abolitionist frame of mind, or am I like welfarist, and a lot of things which are just philosophical, a lot of philosophical in nature, and trying to keep as much of this conversation as possible in applied sense. And that's not because I don't think it's important to discuss that. It's just that in a given span of 90 minutes, it's really hard to cover all of that. At the end of this presentation, I will share my contact details. If anybody is particularly interested in that realm of conversation, I'm always happy to set up an happy hour and discuss some of this. So thank you so much. The Singapore team gave me a broad outlook on or outline on how to speak, and I'll try and kind of keep into that. How it all began is a very interesting story. And like most people interested, so just as a thing, I was born and brought up in a city called Bangalore in India. And growing up in the 90s, in middle school and high school, I saw a lot of wild animal suffering with the urban landscape expanding. So Bangalore as a city in southern India was surrounded around a lot of forest. And as the city grew, we started to encroach a lot upon the wildlife and the urban wildlife. So it just became a huge hub with urban wildlife. And with that came the issue with urban wildlife trafficking and issues with relation to human wildlife conflict. So how it all began was just rescuing a whole lot of urban wildlife. And as you can see, I had a peculiar interest in rescuing baby primates and nurturing them growing up in just out of high school. But while this was happening, I just started to learn and got exposed more into programs. And then just out of high school, I ended up reading this one peculiar article about retailers boycotting Indian leather goods. And I was really, really intrigued by it, in the sense I hadn't ever made the connection of animal suffering and animal product consumption, or just usage of animal products. And I'd read this article way back in 2001 saying that global retail giants like Gap, Hush Puppies, had all stopped like buying leather from India. And I was very intrigued and started to dig a little bit deep into the Indian leather supply chain. And that was probably my first ever introduction to the farm animal suffering, to see as to how we see a lot of these products in isolation, to see how the Indian dairy industry, which is one of the largest in the world, contributed to the Indian leather industry, which was like India's one of the largest or seventh largest exporter of, like, the foreign exchange earner for India was leather goods. So just started to learn a lot more about that. And that drove me to start a life as an undercover investigator. So this is one of the reports that I published in 2005, many years ago, as you see, where I decided to travel to multiple slaughterhouses across the country, and just to record the suffering that happens on animals. So this could be just in either municipal run slaughterhouses or slaughterhouses run by a few private exporters of meat, and also a lot of animal markets, transport routes and stuff like that, and started to look at what condition these animals were. And I guess these initial 4 or 5 years gave me a thorough understanding about the cross-sectionality of animal abuse in itself, as in the slaughterhouse workers who did not have a protective gear, who were working on these conditions, a lot of times just going onto the farm and seeing that it's really hard to just create, to have empathy towards animals just on the worker conditions that were there. And all of this led me to start working on my first ever reform project in around 2005. Right after this, reached out to there was a project run by the Council for Leather Exports. So this was as you can imagine, with all this leather boycott that was happening, be it with relation to like all the major giants stop buying leather from India, the Council for Leather Export definitely wanted to maybe get a better image of them, and this was a great practice for it. So there was a pilot project that I got involved where we took an animal market and a transport route and a slaughterhouse and started to improve conditions on that. And when I mean improve conditions, it could be like in many times what happens in India and likewise in many other countries is like in this part of the world, in the global south, unlike how it happens in the global north, where you have a farm and that particular farm is almost vertically integrated up to a meat packer, and they go through let's say a feedlot where they come there's like a grower finisher farm, and then there's a slaughterhouse, and there's a meat packer, and the leather kind of goes in a lot of this in the global south, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, many other places, maybe even in Vietnam. What you see is that you have small holders who have animals and they bring to a local animal market, live animal market, where these animals get traded, and then these animals get transported from one place to the other to be slaughtered and then processed by someone else, and the leather gets exported or used within that supply chain. And so it was a really, really complex supply chain, and we wanted to try and figure out what solutions can be brought. And then we realized that just building capacity was very important. So this was one of the initiatives in which it was told as to how to humanely slaughter an animal, or like with less pain, how to improve like transport conditions, how to load an animal, unload an animal, euthanasia, building water troughs for animals and stuff like that. So it was a really interesting initiative, just because my initial few years looking at all the suffering that had happened, and when we saw this slaughterhouse work, it was really important. But then what happened was that this program completely failed. And it's a really interesting story as to why this program failed. While the Council for Leather Export was able to invest a whole lot of money to develop, and they weren't doing it for philanthropy at all, as in they were just doing because it was something that was really important, and a lot of buyers had come together to support this initiative. What we saw was that once the new animal market was built, where the animals were checked for their health, there was like enforcement on the total number of animals that can get onto a truck and things like that. Farmers just stopped bringing their animals to that particular market, and farmers just stopped taking their animals to the slaughterhouse, because what we hadn't dealt there was how do we incentivize good behavior, because we had brought all of this and we were just hoping that farmers would just bring their animals to these places, realizing that all of this was just increasing the cost on the farmer's end, and we hadn't really thought about a way to incentivize. And you'll see as to how this project, which maybe I ran in 2005, 6, 7, kind of just evolved into what Global Food Partners does today, because the problem really hasn't changed. Because a lot of times when we do want to talk about welfare of farmed animals, it finally all boils down to how do we incentivize the people who are within that particular supply chain to have higher welfare farm animal production. But we'll come to that a bit later. Um, Learning from that, we also realized that it was need to get some sort of a lot of the learning from the project into standardization. So I started working with the Bureau of Indian Standards and helping to bring in some sort of legislation. So if I've not told earlier, I have a law degree. I basically joined law school just because I realized that maybe in India, one of the best ways to bring in some sort of reform for animals would be to go to law. And again, I have to overemphasize, I think that a lot of time people think that, especially working in India or like running advocacy groups, that a law background is extremely important. Over a period of time, they kind of realize that there's a diminishing value for that as well. But broadly started to talk to the government, because realized that it wasn't just private initiative that was important, because the Council for Leather Export program was a pure private initiative, but there had to be a government initiative to do this. While all of this was happening, an opportunity knocked at my door. And the Humane Society International, which was the international arm of the Humane Society of the United States, one of the world's largest animal protection organization, wanted to establish an office in India. And they approached and they said that, well, if I would be interested to take on this position, and I gladly wanted to take this on because I had seen the approach of the Humane Society in terms of just bringing in welfare and welfare reforms, and was intrigued to kind of follow that route. Um, when we when we took on this issue, till this point of time, you must be thinking that, well, this person must know almost everything about farmed animal welfare. There was one issue that I did not know about at all, and that was intensive confinement of farmed animals. And my then boss, Chetana, introduced me to saying that, well, there's this huge focus on transport and slaughter. And while I'm not saying that that's any less suffering, the suffering of animals that happens on farms, especially with relation to egg laying hens, where they're kept for almost a year or plus in these extreme intensive confinement, where these animals can't spread their wings, stand up straight, turn around, do anything that is absolutely basic to them, causes a huge amount of suffering. It was an issue that I had seen battery cage facilities, I had visited them, had never ever crossed to my mind that, well, that's an issue that needs to be worked on. And I started to learn more and more about battery cages as an issue, and decided that, well, it had to be, something had to be done to move these animals out of cages. While this was happening, the Humane Society International and its parent organization, the Humane Society of the United States, came with a logo saying that it's for all animals. And a lot of progress started to happen with Humane Society International on multiple other aspects. For example, just during my tenure of about 10 years working at the Humane Society International, India saw a ban of import of cosmetics that were tested on animals. This was the first step. Once that was done, India actually even prohibited the testing of cosmetics on animals as well. In India, also banned the import of seal fur and skin. So anything that was happening with Canada, there's this huge sealing industry, and India just decided that they didn't want to do that. You'll see that India actually happened to be one of the world's largest exporters of shark fin. What started off as an initial corporate campaign, getting airlines not to export or not to carry shark fin as a cargo. So on the right side, you'll see this really cool cartoon, which is one of my favorite cartoons, where Jet Airways, then one of the leading private airlines in India, decided not to just ship shark fins. And later on, the government of India just prohibited export of shark fins altogether from the country. What we also saw was there was a huge amount of dissection and animal experimentation happening in schools and colleges. So this was a notification that the government of India brought, that even in the minimum standards requirement for medical education, there wasn't any need for animal experimentation, and computer assisted models had to be used. Um, we also saw that in terms of just like drugs and cosmetics, and just the usage of different types of tests, for example, Drace test, which is like one of the most common imagery that you see, where like the toxicology studies done with for the eye, they decided that the Drace test was not required, and you should use like computer generated models, which was accepted by OECD. So they said that we'll accept data on that. There's also a huge amount of thing in the sense that India, because being just a huge textile market, and India was processing a whole amount of textile, and what we saw was India was importing a whole amount of exotic skins and reptile skins coming in. And so the government of India just decided to ban the import of exotic animal skins and reptile skins. And for this, I happened to visit a slaughterhouse for snakes in Thailand just to see how pythons are grown in farms and then they are slaughtered to get their exotic skin, and the government decided not to do that. We also saw India banning the import of foie gras. So if anybody who knows fatty liver, these animals who are raised on these farms are force fed to have fatty liver, and it's considered as a delicacy. It's not like India was a humongous market for foie gras, but what we really saw was India definitely banned this. It wasn't just there. We saw like in terms of just animals who were confiscated in terms of the Ministry of Climate, MOEF and others had brought in with relation to fish tanks, like people, animals who were sold in aquarium, pet shops, dog breeding, animals who were confiscated, animals in livestock market. So we basically saw that the government of India was willing to legislate, not easily, but because of campaigning of Humane Society International. And there was a very strong partnership with People for Animals, India's largest animal welfare organization. And so this was a great synergy where the India's largest animal welfare organization and one of the world's largest animal welfare organizations got together to push all of this. Now, you must be wondering as to, well, this is all seems like everything is going really well for animals, so it must be fun. But when you really look at it from in hindsight as to how many animals did all of this victory that we talk about deal with, and I think this is a graph that really got me continue to think, right? In the sense that when you really look at all the animal testing that's happening, animals who are in circus, who are in zoos and everything, it kind of dwarfs in front of the animals who are killed and used for food, or like factory farmed animals. And even though this data is for the United States, and we don't have a lot of data for this region because a lot of data is not collected, one could easily extrapolate the same information onto India as well as this region, that a vast majority of the animals that are killed are actually animals who are in farm. And that kind of got me thinking more and more about what can be done more for factory farming, for what can be done for animals who are on factory farms. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, and this is not just an India problem, this is an Asia problem, where you see that a vast majority of the global meat production, if you see the increase and how it stands as of now, happens in Asia. Similarly, a vast majority of egg production, if you just really look at the dark blues, that be India, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of these countries, other than maybe the Americas, almost most of the other egg production also happens in this region. And I could just show you every other animal source protein. You'll basically see that this whole growth is happening in this region. And sadly, these are happening in factory farms with extreme confinement of farmed animals. So when you really start looking at the key issues, and again, not to say that there wasn't any work being done in the region on all of this, it's just that it's phenomenally, as in like exponentially more difficult to get governments or anybody to start acting on some of these issues. For example, battery cages. Like for over a decade, a litigation is happening in India to outlaw battery cages. And we see that there's a humongous pushback from the government on like either outlawing them or with just like any change that is happening. So similarly, around the region, if you were to just extrapolate what's happening in India that I spoke now, if you start looking at any other country in this region, you'll see that the common way in which animals are egg-laying hens are raised are in battery cages. Similarly, with relation to pigs are raised in gestation crates. There's a huge issue with relation to slaughter. A lot of places from Vietnam to India to Malaysia, we see that animals are not necessarily stunned before they're slaughtered. There isn't a huge amount of slaughter regulation. There was this huge scandal, if you might remember, maybe a few years ago, about hammer stunning of animals or hammer slaughter of animals that was happening in Vietnam from the animals who were actually exported from Australia. So live transport of animals in ship is a huge issue. Other than that, there is also a huge problem with relation to just emergency slaughter for disease control. So be it when there is a swine flu outbreak, or there is some sort of swine fever or bird flu, or even like during Corona, COVID, we saw that either because the demand is kind of dropped or there is a need to slaughter these animals, people just live bury them or use the most horrific way of just killing these animals during disease control. Similarly, in terms of just broiler birds, as in these birds were raised for meat, there's a huge amount of suffering that happens. And then, of course, fish. And I'm not even touching emerging issues such as invertebrate welfare at this particular point of time. So broadly, when you start looking at it, each of these categories form a big part of the protein landscape in the region, and in which each of them there is a huge amount of suffering. And wherever there has been little changes that has happened, what we've seen is a humongous pushback either from the industry or from the governments themselves for any and all sorts of pushback. So just to give example, like for example, in India, the maybe in 2013, the Animal Welfare Board of India, through an advisory, said that reading the current Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which says that no person shall confine an animal in a cage or receptacle, which does not measure adequately in length, breadth, or height to provide a reasonable opportunity of movement, said that battery cages would violate that provision of law. And following that, the Delhi High Court said that there cannot be any new cages. The Law Commission of India put out a report saying that the government of India has to phase out battery cages, but we are still seeing that enforcement of these orders, which is getting the government to act, is a huge problem. Similarly, with relation to gestation crates, what we are seeing is growth of gestation crates in the region. And another issue that also kind of comes is a huge amount of repurposing of these crates, especially as in North America, either through legislative actions, that's like in few states with ballot measures, or in places like Canada, where the retailers have gotten together and said that they're not going to use, or in even South America, where there's like a huge corporate commitments, which basically say that they're not going to source pork from animals who are confined in gestation crates. We're seeing that a lot of these crates get repurposed and they're sent to Asia. And we're seeing an emergence of gestation crates in places like India, as well as other regions, which wasn't there. But other than that, of course, when you start looking at Vietnam or China and other places where there's a huge amount of pig production already, gestation crate is commonplace. Slaughter brings in a huge amount of issue. One is, of course, a lot of countries, including India, Malaysia, Indonesia, follow religious slaughter. And in terms of religious slaughter itself, what you see is that there isn't a settled way up on stunning before slaughter. So a lot of times what happens is that even though, for example, in India, the legislation requires that animals have to be stunned before slaughter, we see that it doesn't happen in a lot of other places. The religious requirement might not necessarily allow for stunning to happen. And especially when it comes to birds who have to be stunned, or using more humane way of killing, either through using of inert gases through controlled atmospheric killing, what we see is that that kind of is in direct conflict with religion. There's also, so basically what we end up seeing is that in each of these situations, the animals go through a whole lot of suffering, but the issue kind of just goes under the radar. While we talk about this, if you were to just look at the trends, as in maybe dog meat trade probably gets way more attention and way more Google search and stuff like that in comparison to all this other suffering. Whereas as in, I'm not saying the dog meat trade is better, it's just that in comparison to all this other suffering that's happening for farmed animals, probably it's a tiny thing. So it ends up being an extremely neglected issue overall. And it's something that needs to be done. And there are maybe few reasons as to why it is, because there's only few things that can be done. For example, the plausible interventions to help farmed animals. And I think the first and the most important thing that comes up is public policy, right? And if you see like, well, why don't we just bring in legislations or legal action to reduce either state funding or provide benefits for establishment of alternate farms? And there, one of the key issue that we find is there's a huge agency capture. A lot of times, because of the way legislations are drafted, the agencies within the government who are meant to be promoting animal agriculture also happen to be the one which legislate on animal welfare. And what we see is that there is a direct conflict, or even in that sense where any progress has to happen, there is a huge amount of agency capture. The second thing, but however, there are places where when the governments do want to change, they can change. And the image that you see is where Bhutan happened to be one of the first countries in the region who decided to just end battery cages for egg production and wanted to be a cage-free country. But even be it in Bhutan or in India or any other place, for example, I was speaking to a very dedicated Malaysian activist about the law in Malaysia. And if you really look at that, it's the same law that is there in India, which says that you can't confine these animals in a cage or receptacle which doesn't provide for reasonable opportunity of movement, while it gets implemented for domestic animals or maybe companion animals. Even that sometimes very low. When it comes to implementing on farmed animals, the implementation is almost does not exist at all. So it ends up being a huge barrier. Um, the other issue that also is important is that many a times where we have seen a change that has happened, let's say in many states in in the United States, it's happened because of ballot measures and just participatory democracy. Whereas in many parts of this world, where you just advocacy in itself, the geopolitics of it just does not allow, and it just doesn't happen the way it happens in the global north. And I think this just ends up being a huge issue in terms of public policy. When you really look at corporate policy, as in the corporate policy would be interventions to get food businesses to commit to source only cage-free eggs or similar issues. I guess the key barriers there is that one needs to have an implementable ask, in the sense that is there a technical ability, for example, broilers overall, what's that ask that works for Malaysia, what's that ask that works for Indonesia. Just developing that particular ask becomes very important. And even when we develop the ask, there's a lack of knowledge in higher welfare management. So a lot of times farmers are just not sure. And when they end up setting up something because they oversimplify the process, there can be a failure of the farm and they kind of just paint it, right? For example, let's say if there is one person who set up a traditional battery cage facility and for whatever reasons the bird don't perform well or there's a disease outbreak, they would typically blame themselves saying that we didn't manage that farm well. But when you have a cage-free facility, and if something similar happens, the blame would never go on to the farmer and saying that, well, we didn't know enough to manage this farm well. They'll end up saying, well, just the system is really bad. So it's really important that we just build this knowledge of higher welfare management. There's need to be for a successful model in the region, and there's of course a lack of veterinary extension program overall. The third option, which a lot of people talk about, is social advocacy. This could be just like interventions on an individual level to either choose a higher welfare product or to choose plant-based alternatives, or maybe a option of both. But the key barrier there as animal advocates is just the scale, as in just when you look at what Asia is with so many different languages, cultures, cuisine, food choices, and each of this, we see that scale ends up being the problem. Language and sometimes even like dialects is a big problem. And also a lot of times when we start talking about a particular way of diet, there's a cultural context that needs to be understood. And in many places, there is a huge problem with like in an internet penetration, in the sense that how do you even get this information in hands of just so many people? And so that obviously ends up being a huge barrier. So that kind of brings my story to what we are doing here as Global Food Partners and what brings me to Singapore. And this is probably the last leg of mine. Realizing all of this problem with a simple theory of change, that if we are able to get corporates to transition to higher welfare cage free, it sets up a model for governments and others to start looking at developing standards for cage free hens. We set up Global Food Partners. The mission of Global Food Partners is very simple. We help food businesses fulfill their cage free commitments, and we support farmers to transition. And the reason why Global Food Partners and why I chose, along with my two other co-founders, to set up Global Food Partners is there was this huge momentum on global cage-free commitments, and there was a real risk that these cage-free egg policies will not be implemented in Asia. There was also an issue that farmers needed hands-on localized support that we said, and that's something that we provide. And other than that, we also provide innovative approaches. So this could be like setting up of a model farm and training center in Indonesia and China. We've taken learning from other sustainable commodities like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil to set up a credit trading system just to use in market mechanisms to implement these cage-free commitments. So the way we work is we help food businesses with planning. So we partner with them to understand what their supply chain is, and we do a thorough planning. This planning results in a supply chain assessment, and from the supply chain assessment, we develop a roadmap for the companies. Once the roadmap is accepted, we provide technical support to farmers so that they're able to successfully transition. And we also provide support through our training center as well as Impact Alliance, which is a market mechanism to help farmers just move from cage to cage free. And I can talk more about it or send information if you're interested. But while we implement this, we still see that there is a huge gap in this region which needs to be filled. First is that there is still a lack of technical ability. So be it in terms of just curriculum that is being taught at animal husbandry or veterinary and stuff like that, we see that animal welfare is not necessarily a part of it, or even just like raising animals in higher welfare farms is not a part of it. There's also issues with relation to operations because the legal landscape is really, really difficult. So if we as an organization or any other organization wants to operate in different parts of this different countries in this part of the world, just on like what's the legal situation, how do you hire somebody, just like setting up all of this operation ends up being a huge problem. There's also a talent gap in terms of just understanding how public policy is made in the region and how could one potentially understand that and leverage that public policy making effort to benefit farmed animals. We also need people who understand the finance world and the sustainability finance world, because a lot of these farms get financed, and like there is some work that's been done by Ben McCarran's group and a few others, but we broadly see that just having that kind of understanding, and even with relation to countries who are high populous, high populous, low income countries, there's a huge amount of aid financing that happens, and one would have to start looking at aid financing as to how to nudge these aid finance on higher welfare. There's up just like communications and just working with companies with CSR and sustainability. So literally in whatever stage of career one is and in whatever specialization, be it in the humanities, economics, social sciences, or engineering, there is definitely a need to work in farmed animals, and there's a way to work on it. So that's really a quick primer on where I started, how I reached here. That's my email address, and that QR code is for my WeChat. So if you would either like to catch me up on WeChat or send me an email to learn more and chat more, I'm happy to do that. But look forward to question and answers and a discussion. Thank you so much. I don't think it's an either or question. I think it's both. And when it kind of, and we see that there is a huge amount of growth that's happening in protein diversification, be it in terms of cellular meat or in terms of just plant-based alternatives. So there is definitely a growth that's happening. And to me, it just seems that um, like, it might, as in factory farming and just using animals to produce food is inefficient. And we all know that, right? As the technology kind of grows and as the human population increases, we will start looking at more efficient way. And sadly, till this point, the more efficient way of growing this has been to trade select these animals to produce more and externalizing on animal welfare. So for example, a broiler was trade selected to put on their body weight in 45 days, what they would typically put on in a year's time. An egg laying hen who was only typically laying maybe 40 to 60 eggs in a year was trade selected to put on around 300 plus eggs in a year. So what humans have broadly done as a species is to trade select to increase for food production. But I think that maybe it is going to happen, but I'm not necessarily convinced that the solution is just going to be that the world's going to move away from animal agriculture altogether. So my theory is that while in certain economies, certain countries, there might be a change towards plant-based, and I'm hoping that it does happen. What you see is that we would need to definitely just improve the welfare of animals, and it's something that the news that even the industry shares. And you really start looking at one of the largest meat packers or the largest animal agriculture industries, they have now started to drop their own plant-based line. We've also started to see some growth in hybrid products, which are both meat as well as plant-based. So broadly, I think at least in the medium term, I don't think that this issue is going to be a binary issue. I think what this is going to be is a spectrum issue, that there are going to be end users of spectrum who might want to do this, but there might be the belly of the pyramid, which will continue to consume animals. And as income grows, probably only more, and hence focus on welfare. Finally, it all just comes down to, as I said, it's not an either or. I think if I were to just look at the neglectedness of the issue, I do feel that there has been a considerable amount of both market-based as well as philanthropic initiative when it comes to alternative of protein. We sadly haven't seen such kind of efforts that has happened in terms of welfare. And so the focus really, at least from us, is the fact that this is a neglected issue. And when an issue is neglected, and anybody, and you probably know this better than I do, like, just like the little that we can do just has a huge impact overall. And hence, when you really look at all of this problems, even in countries, I would say, of all the countries in this region, India is probably advanced when it comes to animal welfare, public policy, and litigation. And you still see that farmed animals are so neglected when it comes to that. And it's kind of is true overall. So in terms of neglectedness, we feel that that's where it is. And I think that and that's one of the many reasons why we continue to focus on welfare rather than just alt protein. And again, it's not a binary, it's both. So you could be literally any career option, and there is a way to help farmed animals for sure. So as in, I would be love to like a challenge as to in what career trajectory you are or what your interest area is, and there's a way to do that. But if I were to rank in order of priority as to what's really needed in this region, one is, of course, just the technical ability in terms of just animal welfare science and animal behavior science. So this could be in terms of just knowing animal behavior so that we're able to provide. So if you're like super early in your career, I mean, like if trying to figure out what your majors is at this point of time, one might want to start looking at that aspect overall, just in terms of animal ethology as a subject, so that we are able to develop that point of science. Other than that, there is definitely a need in terms of mainstreaming animal welfare within CSR and other ESG related conversations, because a lot of times what you see is that the ESG related conversations end up being in conflict with animal welfare rather being in center of animal welfare. And so I definitely do think that one's required with that. And again, the third thing, and I feel like so important, and it's something that's not glamorous, is operation role. A lot of time when we say that, there's like a hello hero effect when you're like on the ground campaigner wanting to do stuff, but a lot of times, especially at least with just the varied experience that I've had working with organizations, you see that it's the operations bottleneck that can really, really hinder progress and just the ability for animal advocates to do good. And if you're just a pure operations person who can do like good in accounting, ensure that the bills are paid on time, the credit cards are paid on time, telephone is running, the internet's running, the Microsoft SharePoint is organized well, I think that just the value that one could even potentially bring with that is really high. So I would definitely think that think diverse. And a lot of time what you realize is that there's meta support that's required in organizations. So this could be like, how do you operate? Do you set up as a private limited with shares? Do you come with the private limited with guarantee? How does one even enter into Myanmar? What's happening in Myanmar? Like, we don't know these kind of situations. So, or like let alone Myanmar, like even if you were to think like Malaysia or like Vietnam and places like that. So I would imagine that operations technical ability, and like broadly with relation to corporate relations is probably the three top areas where there is a huge need for people to do that. So we have staff who don't, for example, I don't speak any Asian, as in if you were to consider Indian language as Asian language, then I do. But other than that, I don't speak any Asian language. So that are two of our co-founders. So I definitely do think that there is a role, but definitely if somebody who can speak an Asian language is an added benefit overall. But I do think that a lot of time it finally boils down to bringing the message from within the community, and how one is able to narrate that conversation and bring that conversation, which is culturally relevant to that particular country. Because I think a lot of time what happens is that either when people come in, they come in with a bias. Like, for example, a lot of time, and again, I'm sorry for defaulting on India, but that's where my big amount of skill set is. Like a lot of people who'd come into India with the default that India is a place where animals are taken care of really well, like the land of ahimsa. Because if you really look at it from outside, with all the progress that I spoke about and like just the culture, you would say, well, it's really great. But it's just that the context of suffering and how suffering is kind of seen as part of life. And like this is a complex issue with relation to suffering and intervention in India, right? Or just like how people are indifferent towards suffering because there's just so much suffering that happens. Like if you're someone who just like cry walking on the streets, it's really hard to walk down on a street, be it with relation to animals or human suffering in many parts of India or many other parts of this world, right? Or I would say rather the global south itself. And to me, it just seems that when it isn't the language that is important, I think what's really important is being willing to be open to empower the community where you plan to work so that the change happens from there and it's led. I think what I would definitely not encourage is to come from like a headquarters knows best syndrome, saying that, well, it worked in California. Why doesn't it work in Singapore? Isn't it the same when it comes to GDP? Like in the sense, like that's not how it would work. So in the sense, so just to answer your question in really short, language isn't the barrier, but I think it's just the mindset of the fact that if you're coming into a new country, a culture, just to say that you're there as a tool to bring a learning from another place to empower a community to do, rather than to say that, oh, well, I know how to do and I'm going to tell people to do. I'll take the insect farming one question first because that's probably the hardest to answer. Um, I think the problem with, and I think one of the key barriers that I said is an implementable ask. And I think with insect farming, where we really are struggling is what is that implementable ask, and actually what is our confidence level in just that. I think a part of me just says err on the side of caution. And if you were to just say, well, but then sadly, either public policy or corporate policy cannot work on saying that, well, err on the side of caution. So I guess like on insect farming is a story that cannot be completed at this point of time. We need to see how it evolves, but it's definitely something that we all have to kind of keep our eyes and ears open. Because there's also another issue with relation to insect farming. And again, not to kind of deviate from farm animal suffering in the sense that there is no qualitative or quantitative way to compare insects in the wild and their suffering versus insect on farm, and to say that if one is better than the other. And even if we were to kind of say that insects in the wild suffer more than insects on the farm, then there is really no reason as to why intervention should only be with relation to insect farming and not insects in the wild. But I think that all of those are questions that cannot be answered at this point of time, but I think is a good question to keep thinking about. Um, as far as Singapore is concerned, I think Singapore is a really interesting country, and where you kind of, other than as in one of the largest egg producers is already has a cage-free range. Getting cage-free eggs is super easy in Singapore, as in be it in Red Mart or Lazada or like walking into NTUC or cold storage, as in you really get cage-free eggs everywhere, and the price is actually not that high. Of course, if you were to take like free range eggs from New Zealand, because Singapore is very particular about from where it allows free range eggs. So for just people who might not know the difference, free range is also kind of cage free. The only difference is that in free range, birds are given outdoor access, whereas in cage-free, the birds are not given outdoor access. So that's the primary difference between free range and cage-free. So in Singapore, I guess, be it with relation to 30 by 30, the focus of the government being so much on alt protein and stuff like that, it's huge. I think, but so to me, the Singapore problem is not the problem of Singapore consumption. The problem really is that Singapore is a headquarter to multiple regional offices of multiple corporates. And in that sense, also Singapore leads the way in just change. And the fact that the FSA has approved clean meat or cellular meat is a huge victory, or like just like the amazing development that's happened in Singapore. So I guess the focus in Singapore is going to be how are we to leverage the development that's happening in Singapore, everything happening in the right direction, that it's very hard to point either in 30 by 30 or in broadly the way the Singapore government is dealing with this, as well as the market analysis here. Like, for example, you could walk into a 7-Eleven in Singapore and buy a Impossible Burger for $5.80. So probably that's something that you can't do in many other places, right? So I guess the issue really comes is that how are we able to leverage the development in Singapore in many other places? And what we kind of see is that a lot of other states around the world romanticize Singapore and want to be like Singapore. And I think that Singapore is setting the absolute right tone for the region on sustainable protein. It's really hard because it's so hard to get counterfactuals. And in fact, this is just a conversation that we were having with our co-founders just this evening, saying that, well, come 2025, what's the counterfactual as to if GFP wasn't there, what happened? Like, it's really, really hard to measure. That's also primarily because such infancy in the stage. So in the sense that when you have, I would imagine that one would have to take at least a 7 to 8 year outlook for any change, that's markable change to happen. And that's like in the best case scenario. I would say even long term is what one would have to take. So to me, it seems that the best KPI, few things. One thing is that I think saying that we are going to somehow beat the curve and reduce the total number of animals who are raised for food, I would think is being super ambitious. And I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So I think even if you were to just look at the global number of people who choose a plant-based diet, it kind of has remained stable. And when we've actually seen dip, right, as in like I remember like maybe in 2006, 2007, maybe around that time, I was at a conference and like one of the leaders in the farm animal movement in the US said that the meat consumption is really going down, and showed a graph that, well, you saw like there's a dip in overall consumption of meat and stuff like that. What you really saw was that it wasn't people's preference changing. It was just that there was a slump in the economy overall, and meat products were just following the general consumption pattern that was happening across commodities. And we see this all the time, right? Suddenly you see a drop in diesel car buying, and then there's like a sweeping statement being made, which would say, well, the millennials and Gen Zs are like all going for Teslas. And then you kind of see them, there is like a sudden increase in all of that. So broadly, I would say like there are few indicators, and I think that what we will be looking at is some at micro level as well as macro level. And I feel that sometimes even trade shows, and like at an absolute micro level, the way we would look at it is like in a trade show, like for example, in Thailand, every 2 years, there's this humongous trade show of the animal agriculture industry that's happened, which I've probably visited for the past 10 years without missing one. And has an equipment company displayed a cage-free equipment for sale. That in itself is also a micro indicator of change that's kind of happening, right? In the sense that, yes, well, there is an interest that you're seeing. On larger macro level, I think that we're seeing governments talking about it. For example, the government of Thailand, as we speak, has brought out a regulation to regulate cage-free. We're seeing an increased amount of certifiers in the region. So at this point of time, what you really see is looking at picking up different indicators to see whether we are meeting it. At an organizational level, you could have KPIs. You could say, well, did I meet with X number of companies? Did I get a contract with X number of companies? But I don't think that's a reflection of the overall cage-free growth. So I would say that keeping eyes and ears open to look at both these micro as well as macro level feelers in the region is what's going to be very important. But I think at this point of time, for which I don't have an answer, is the counterfactual, in the sense like if we did not have this webinar, if none of us spoke about this, would cage free still increase? We don't know that answer. And probably what would be interesting is to start looking at Africa, because I feel like Africa is kind of on following the Asia trajectory. And there again is not a huge farm animal movement there. And like to see maybe Africa in the Middle East, where there isn't, probably those would end up being showing some counterfactuals on what would happen if there wasn't a growing movement. I think it's a positioning issue. And I think that one of the key issues is that is animal welfare something that just sits outside the larger sustainability conversation, or are we able to bring them in part of the conversation? And I feel like as people who care about animals, we need to do everything that we can to bring this conversation into it. For example, biosecurity, right? In the sense that just improving biosecurity is good for the animals, is good for the planet. So in that sense, that are we able to just use that? Or in terms of just like sustainable consumption, like sustainable consumption would fall under like the UN Sustainable Development Goal, and then you're able to do this. In the sense, what it really boils down is that how are you able to frame this argument? But I guess there are two issues there. One is sometimes we as animal advocates get so enamored on like all the societal impact of this. And so we kind of just start making this strong climate change argument, health, this, that, and the other, which depending on what paper and which media publication you subscribe to is refutable, right? In the sense like there's probably equal number of paper which says that beef is good because of regenerative agriculture as much as it says that beef is bad. In the sense like if you were to just do the Google search, and it depends on which echo chamber you are a member of to do that. But I think what's irrefutable is the suffering that these animals go through in factory farms, and the fact that the externalities of this goes beyond animals. So for example, I spoke way behind, like when I was doing an investigation work into a lot of these slaughterhouses in India, and I've gone to many others in many other parts of the world, just the farmer welfare is or like the worker welfare is so hard, like in the sense like working with no gloves, no gumboots, just like dealing with knives which are really blunt is super hard. Or in terms like when you walk into a factory farm, or like and like, like literally people walking through knee deep of feces. Modern day slavery is something that's super common in many aquaculture, fishing boats and stuff like that, and also in some of the farms. So I guess what's really important, and I think that's one of the issues that Global Food Partners is trying to solve by being member of what we call, and I didn't get a chance to speak about it, being member of the Impact Alliance. So the Impact Alliance is an alliance of key sustainability initiatives, which includes the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, Proterra, which does sugar and soy, the Textile Exchange, which does down and cotton fiber and many other textiles, including leather, and Global Food Partners, which does eggs. And what we're doing is we're coming together to start seeing cross-sectionality amongst these different commodities and animal welfare, and also other indicators like zero deforestation and conversion free and other social metrics that exist. So I guess uh, and I think when people are in conflict, I think it's conflict because we tend to peg one issue against the other. So I think that it's when it comes to animal welfare, the way I see it, it's never pegged one against the other, but it's like together. For example, the common thing that you see is food security, right? In the sense that, oh, well, we are a country and we need to grow. And just when you just look at the science of food security, you kind of see that, again, India, right? One of the world's largest producers of meat, one of the largest producers of milk, one of the largest producers of eggs, all within the top 5 realm, right? But has more number of people who are stunted and has issues with relation to malnutrition and stuff like that than sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, you have more number of people who have all the modern disease issues. Now, when you really look at the rural landscape in the country, you see that the rural people in rural India, the per capita consumption of eggs drops to 7 eggs. So it's per person just 7 eggs. Whereas in urban India, it drops to, it increases up to 220, 250. In some parts of India, it goes all the way to 300. And you see that it's
This is per year?
per year per person, per year per person. And you see that's inequitable, right? You don't need to be an economist to kind of figure out as to where diabetes is in the spectrum and in which household there is stunting and malnutrition, right? And what you're really looking at is like an equitable consumption, in the sense that are people who are eating less increase and are people who are eating more reduce, in the sense that that's the equitable consumption. And then you start seeing that intensive confinement of farmed animals is actually against equitable consumption, because what happens is that when you have large volumes, you need the scale. And when you have sparsely populated villages, it's really hard to get these protein into them. However, smallholder agriculture, like for example, what Bhutan did, where it got each of its districts or even villages to be self-sufficient to protein, increases, right? It's something that's good. So in the sense, what you really need to be doing, I feel, is not to peg one issue against the other, but to kind of see that there is an institutional issue in terms of just factory farming and animal agriculture. And one would need to just see as to how it just makes sense so that it's a win-win-win situation for everybody, rather than making it seem like if it has to be a win for animals, then like a handful of people who have to lose. It's really complex, and I think that there's again no one, it's, I can't make a sweeping statement on how it could in terms of just religion. And I do feel that different religions come with their own issues when it comes to dealing with, be it with relation to be it tradition, culture, and it's just all gets interwoven. But I think what I can say is that as animal advocates, we have to be aware about this issue. And I think that's where, I guess, like when it came to talent gap, I said that cultural relevance is extremely important, so that when you're having that conversation, you're taking these religious conflict, the societal conflict, the geopolitics of this into your conversation and having that conversation, rather than saying, well, how can you, like, for example, I guess one of the biggest things is with, let's say, and not related to farmed animals, is mercy release, right? As in anybody who does mercy release. So for people who might not know, it's a common religious tradition where people buy animals and then they release them. And then a lot of times these animals end up either being recaptured and sold again, or they end up being invasive species which have to be culled. And like there are many other issues that are associated with mercy release. Like, so for example, mercy release of turtles into freshwater pond can create a huge series of invasive species, and they have to be culled and all of that. But when you really look at it from the person's point of view who is doing the mercy release, is to just go and point out and say what you're doing is really cruel, is not going to work. In the sense, just to understand the context of mercy release. And in that sense, are we able to change that conversation within? And I guess like what's really required is the sense of just patience, the sense like just patience, understanding what each of these traditions mean, and then working with people who understand that local community really well, and then pushing for change is what's required. I think the problem really comes is that we do something knee-jerk without understanding the unintended consequences, or sometimes even just the consequences. Leave alone unintended consequences is a far stretch. And like, not to take a group, for example, recently an animal protection group in India wrote a letter to one of the country's largest milk cooperative. And for anybody who knows about India, India really it prides its milk cooperative, because India is the largest milk producer in the world. And most of its milk comes from cooperative farms, where you have like smallholders or food insecure households with like one or two cattle, mostly women driven, who bring milk. And then they have this whole thing. It's called as Operation Flood. And a letter was written saying that, well, we expect you to start manufacturing soy milk. But I think that it's such a simple outlook to a complex problem, and the kind of output that came against, I just feel like it then starts painting the entire animal protection community as unreasonable, because you haven't backed it up in the sense that what's the societal impact of doing that? What's the food security impact of doing that? Is that the most efficient ask overall? While you could have potentially said that, well, there is an issue with relation to welfare, you could do this, and in the meantime working on it. Or if it's so important, then potentially run an RCT in like a handful of villages where there are dairy animals, and handful where there's maybe plant-based milk, and to see some economic impact on that. I feel like a lot of times when groups react and do things without understanding the consequences of what it can be, or not just being backed by science, it just paints the entire movement to be these people who just like are extremely emotional, irrational. And I think that kind of goes, and I think what's really good, and I think I'm really thankful for ES Singapore for doing that, because it's effective altruism is so much grounded into rationality. And I feel like that whole marriage between animal welfare and rationality, so that the ask is rational, is only going to help animals. I think the animal experimentation world can broadly be divided into three categories. One is education-based learning. So this could be in graduate school, undergraduate school, where you're like just learning dissection and doing experimentation and stuff like that. And there have been either ethically sourced cadavers. So a lot of veterinary education, for example, institutions tie up with a shelter and they source cadavers from them and then they use that. So I think that ends up being. The second is when it comes to drug discovery. I think that's a huge place. And what we've kind of seen, even with relation to COVID vaccine discovery, that animals are not a model, like because over 80% of all medicines, and I don't quote me on the statistics, it's partly in that, which pass animal testing fails when it comes to human trials, because just because we are not rabbits. But anyway, broadly what we're seeing is that a growth on what's called as like a human body on advanced outcome pathways, in the sense of just like human body on a chip, lung on a chip, kidney on a chip, where you're able to actually get these results directly from human organs rather than doing something on an animal and then extrapolating onto a human being. The third place that where it happens is with relation to toxicology studies, like toxicity testing. So this could be in terms of anything that you think, from like from paint to chemicals to your nail polish to cosmetics, everything goes through toxicology studies. And there, I think what you're really looking at is the adverse outcome pathways. And there are two aspects. One is we've just done so much animal experimentation already. So you can just take, so example, that's what happened with cosmetics, right? In cosmetics, you kind of have come to a point that there are no novel ingredients anymore. So the mascara that you have, the newest mascara is a sum total of all the mascaras manufactured till now. So there's nothing new about that. So in that sense, if you're able to take all data that has come there, so you're able to use data science to get those results, and you see that those results are probably same or even better than animal trials. Other than that, the similar way in terms of just having huge databases of as to how the adverse outcome pathways work with relation to data science, which works. And then of course, the human body on the chip, kidney on the chip and all of that. And what we're seeing is that what really started off during the Gulf oil spill, where you had to come up with something really quick, where the US EPA started to invest in these non-animal testing, this whole area of science has really grown. But again, I'm no expert on this, so you should definitely look at the Humane Society International has a really good research and toxicology department, so you should shoot them up, and they probably have a lot more information. But this is my layman way of what the alternatives are. The line between private and public is not that easy to find out, as in just with like complex structures of business and stuff like that. So I guess the broad issue is with relation to how do you develop a regulatory landscape. And I think there are two broad issues in that. One has been self-regulation, saying that broadly the state, it's not the, anything that the state regulates is not one of the, again, there's two different schools of thought, and I'm not saying one is correct than the other, it probably depends on which country you're talking about, is to say that, well, the state is not probably the best person to regulate anything, and so state shouldn't be in the business of regulation, and the industry should self-regulate. There's one aspect of that. The other people who say that, well, you can't let the industry self-regulate. It's like, how can you do that? You need to have state supervision. Maybe a hybrid of both is what is really required, in the sense that there is some amount of self-regulation and some amount of state supervision. But there are also multiple other safeguards that can be built. And I think one of the key safeguards is with relation to financing safeguards. So a lot of international finance institutions are, or even like banking systems are, where you see that they sponsor or like provide loans or equity or different sorts of financing on this. And when, but for example, DBS has DBS, Standard Chartered, all of them have like a really good life. For example, Standard Chartered almost through its safeguard policy does not fund intensive animal agriculture. DBS has actually gone one step ahead, and they actually gave a preferential loan to a farmer in Singapore who wanted to set up a cage-free facility. So I believe like maybe there is financing, there is also shareholders, but again, I would say when it comes to regulation, I don't think it's just saying really strong state regulation is required is the right way. I think what you would really require is, again, depending on the socio-economic, geopolitical conditions of each of these places, to look at just different models of regulation. In some places, it could be just, for example, in places like Canada, right? As in or even Australia, what the change is happening is not because of legislation, it's just because of retailer driven. Retailers said that we're not going to do this, brands said that we're not going to buy cage-free eggs, and then you kind of saw that follow through. We've also seen that happening in terms of like net zero commitments on carbon, where it's the industry that came first and the governments followed through. There are other places where the governments come first and the industry follows through. In other places, for example, big dams is a good example, right? Where it wasn't the industry, it wasn't the state, it was bank. It's like World Bank saying that we don't want to be sponsoring any more big dams. It's such a huge nightmare for us. So I think that kind of got people to start looking at watershed development different than big dams. So again, to answer no one question, depends on each country, depends on each industry, and each industry probably has different ways of regulating. The writing on the wall is very clear that it's Asia for farm animals. It's time for farm animals in Asia for a better life. There isn't any doubt on that at all. I do feel that broadly on the of animal farming overall, I think uh, just again, I would say that don't not to have dichotomy saying that, well, it has to be either plant-based or welfare. I think they both kind of go hand in hand. And it's not just us, also the industry is looking at it. For example, CP Foods now has a plant-based line. So you can imagine like one of the largest companies. And we've also seen a lot of other businesses who are investing in this. So all I'm saying is in whatever stage of career you are, and wherever you are, it's time to speak up for farmed animals. And again, I shared my WhatsApp, my WeChat link as well as email ID. And I know there was a lot of questions that I couldn't get through, but I absolutely love chatting about this. So, like literally, maybe not during the working week, but during on a Saturday or whenever, if you'd like to schedule a call with me, chat up, I'm always happy to chat and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much, Mani Divya, for putting this together and all the team at ES Singapore. And I know that you plan to do a lot more on the whole farm animal space and also other cause areas. So really appreciate you doing this. And I feel like just on the, this is just going to bring in more talent in the space, which is so required.